Michalopoulos. He's an economist, or at least a political economist, not a microeconomist like we are used to discuss with. He's a more political economist and really very original in his research. You can, in the chat, we can put the list of publications. And he's an old, if I may say, he's an old-fashioned scholar following questions all over the world in the very different domains, in Asia, in Europe, in databases, in etc. It's really interesting for us because we discovered that there was a big repository of folklore traditions named Folklore. I hope he will be present later. That is incredibly rich. It has the same functionalities that the Human Relations 5 you are used to, but with folk traditions. I might say that it for me is especially interesting because my first research work was precisely on this topic: folklore traditions, Arne, Thompson, Prop, all the classical researchers in this field. And this idea of transcultural comparison of motifs, transcultural comparison of folkloric or oral traditions is especially interesting for me as well. So, okay, Stelios, hopefully this will be just the first talk on many others. So please go ahead. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you for making the time. I know most of us are Mediterraneans, so the fact that we are in the middle of July talking about folklore is a testament to our intellectual curiosity. Okay, so now you may be wondering why an economist is, getting into these domains of knowledge. So let me tell you a little bit about my path. So my research is mostly geared towards understanding how historical events, accidents, geography, in the spirit of, you could think of Jared Diamond, you can think of other historians, global historians, how they think about the formation of the seeds of contemporary standards of living. So, okay, so I'm an economist in heart. I want to understand what causes variation in standards of living across the world today. One of the prominent explanations that have been come to our in the domain of economics the last few decades is the role of culture. And so, like, the usual narrative is that, okay, there is some historical event, it's a big one, could be forced displacement, could be slavery, could be the exposure to a certain type of bottleneck, that basically the culture at this point is going to be reshaped. You're going to adopt best responses given the environment that you face. These best responses will be enshrined in some type of cultural package that you will carry with you as you move forward, informing your decisions economically, either in terms of how you view your appetite for risk, or how altruistic you are, or how patient you are, or what is the proper gender roles, and so on and so forth. So that's kind of the idea behind, or the narrative of, okay, culture matters. It has been formed under certain very important events. It's hard to change. You carry it with you. So you may be an immigrant in the US, but you are of Greek tradition, or you are a Euskera, or you are from Basque County, and you keep on behaving as if the culture comes with you. So the problem with this narrative, which you will in many economic applications we will bump into, is that we really cannot measure culture back in time. We only have great data for today. And by today, I mean for data the last 20, 30 years. You can think of the World Value Surveys, the European Value Surveys, more local surveys that try to get at the attitudes of people. You will see a lot of regressions in our discipline that connect some historical event or some geographic endowment to a certain type of behavior today, assuming that these kind of preferences were formed at some point and they keep on transmitting intergenerationally, informing the relationships we see. The problem is that, of course, as a social scientist, this is all make-believe. If you cannot measure it, you can have beautiful stories, but then you are sort of saying, well, is it true that my great-great-grandparents that I never got to meet, would they have, kind of attitudes that are similar or dissimilar from my attitudes? So this is where this paper is born. Did I do something? No. Okay.
No.
So
okay.
We're going to try to measure beliefs and attitudes of pre-industrial societies. Ideally, we wanted to go back in time and run the world value surveys. We're not there yet. Time machines maybe will be available at some point, but we're not there. And, once we have access to this kind of magical, corpus, we can then also ask a bunch of characteristics that as economists we care about, like, for example, trade. Trade is very important economic variable. It has not been recorded very thoroughly in the various data sets that we have been using, either from Murdoch or the Ethnographic Atlas or the Standard Cross-Cultural Sample. The evidence is spotty. Okay, so what is out there, at least from a point of view of economists, we have the Ethnographic Atlas, the Standard Cross-Cultural Sample. So then if we can add to this corpus, values, data on values, attitudes and beliefs, we would be kind of complementing this corpus. We can reconstruct traits that are not present, and we can recover groups that they are not covered by the Ethnographic Atlas. I'm talking about the Ethnographic Atlas because, for whatever idiosyncratic reason, this has been a massive success among economists. And I understand that there is a debate about the veracity of this corpus and the measurement error it has, the biases, but that's going to be my point of departure. We're going to basically take it as given and try to complement it with new data. Okay, how we're going to shed light? We're going to shed light by using the lore of the group. Now, what is the folklore? It's the collection of fictional stories, myths, jokes, and proverbs, songs, tales, codes, rituals of celebration. So you read the definition, that's the Webster Merriam Definition Dictionary, and you think that folklore is kind of the definition of culture. It's everything that one would be willing to basically think of it as a cultural expression. And usually it's not taught at school, it's all curriculum based and is coming from intergenerational transmission. So in the US, at least, you can do at Brown or Harvard or Princeton a major in economics and a minor in folklore studies. So it's also an academic discipline. So it's the field of scholarship that is devoted to the documentation, classification, and interpretation of lore and life, folklore life. And it's kind of, it's a hybrid. It's in between humanities and social sciences. Exactly, they deal with text, so that's the humanities part. But the questions they ask, they're usually more on the social science side. Let me spend 2 minutes on the brief history of the field, just to understand where it is right now and what, if we were to ask an oral historian, he would place this work as of that period. So, okay, so folklore studies starts in the 19th century, basically with the publication of the Grimm brothers. These are the two German siblings. They're going to go out in Germany, catalog stories. Now you may ask yourself, now why then? Why 19th century becomes kind of the inception of the field? Well, it's two things going on: Romanticism as a movement, as a literary movement, and urbanization that kind of makes people think that, look, within few decades, the rural lifestyle will be transformed totally. Everybody will become a worker in a mill factory. So there is kind of this urge to go out and catalog what the rural lights are talking about before it's too late and you will find no one to tell you about the old ways. So, colonization will take place. So there will be basically a massive gathering of new information from indigenous societies across the world. So, that's going to be the 19th century. Monographs about the stories of is your favorite group. So an important advance in the early 20th century is that they're going to say, okay, now we have all this material. How are we going to make sense? Already Jose alluded to that is like Arne Thompson would basically start kind of the motif cataloging, saying, okay, now we have to deconstruct the stories. We have to think of its constituent elements. What are these? Are motifs. These are irreducible parts of a plot. And so if we do that, then we can actually start comparing cultures. So this is now we're in the realm of comparative mythology. That is, I can compare text, which is, by the way, revolutionary for this, as a revolutionary idea at this point in time. So that's going to happen for the first 20th century. The part of the 20th century, variants of the particular story, tale, ballad will basically classified into motifs. And we will start getting some glimpses of, the aerial distribution of motifs. Now, by the end of the 20th century, folklorists will abandon this genre of mythology. They will think that this is a futile endeavor. You cannot really compare stories. Stories are idiosyncratic. It's very different if José tells the story versus Sylvia. It's very different if José tells the story at 9 in the morning to Stelios versus 10 in the morning to another guy. So then they say, look, it's all relative. It's the apotheosis of relativism. Context matters. Then you cannot really compare. For our purposes, we're going to remain in the domain of comparative mythology, because we want to try to compare text, if you wish, between cultures. But that's for basically context, and this is why folklore is kind of a dying field, exactly because they are averse to the idea of comparisons. And the social scientists are all into comparisons, so you have this kind of oxymoron going on. But we came in, and this is where we meet our hero. So every story has a hero. Our hero is Yuri Bereskin. Why he's our hero? Because he's the guy that basically is behind the corpus that I'm going to navigate you in the rest of the talk. He's an octogenarian. It is one of these very great scholars that he's now the curator of the Museum of Anthropology in St. Petersburg. He did his PhD in the 70s in the US. His idea was basically to build on ATU, Arne Thompson Ute Index, but the kind of a well-known among anthropologists or folklorists is that this index is very much centered on European motifs. And then it's all about how you compare the world, how you view the world through the lenses of a Eurocentric understanding of myths and stories. So his understanding comes from the fact that, okay, let me actually build a catalog that is going to be free from, as possible, from Eurocentric biases, exactly because he starts building it from the stories of the indigenous societies in the Americas, and then expands further this catalog to the rest of the world. So if anything, he would have an Americanocentric bias instead of Eurocentric bias. So so I met Yuri at some point in 2019, I think 2018, and I'm telling him, look, it's a beautiful, you see, it seems to me from what I read in your research, you're sitting on something beautiful. Can you share it with us? He gets back to me very quickly, says, it's the first time an economist reaches out. I never thought that an economist would ever be interested in this, but what the heck? Here you are. So what do we get? We get basically an Excel sheet which has a very peculiar structure. It is 2,500 columns. Each column has a header. The header tells me a snippet of a story. I'm going to talk about it. It's a motif. So usually think of it as 2-3 lines, which kind of summarizes a story or part of a story. And then 1,000 rows, 0 ones, does this oral tradition, which in our point of view is a group, usually an ethno-linguistic group, is this particular story, snippet, motif, present in its oral tradition. Okay, so what we're going to do in the beginning, we're going to try to make some sense of this catalog. Now, you see, folklore is a very rich discipline, of course, right? And there is a lot of ways that people have thought about interpreting folklore. There is the Freudian view that basically it's the unseen that is actually narrated in the folklore. there is other, like more functional views that say that it's the scene that is manifested in the stories. But from the point of view of an economist, given that we would like to popularize it among economists and social scientists more broadly, we took a first step in saying, okay, let me actually find out whether some very salient characteristics of these groups, perhaps related to its geography, are going to be manifested in the stories that are being narrated. So we're going to have some perhaps obvious or trivial correlations, but this was an important step for us to build credence, to confidence that this corpus actually does reflect something about the group that eventually we're going to actually try to infer characteristics that we cannot, find elsewhere. So, okay, so we're going to use a dictionary-based approach to elicit group-specific intensity to various traits. In other words, we're going to say, okay, very simple. Is this a group that lives near an earthquake zone? Okay, that I know the location of the group. I can measure how close it is to a tectonic plate. So I know its exposure to historical exposure to earthquakes. And then I'm going to basically ask the question, how often the word earthquakes pops up across the motifs? If you've never seen an earthquake, it's going to be very rare, should be very rare. If you have been exposed very often, that's going to be something that you will have to grapple, and that's going to be manifest. That's one application, but that's kind of in the beginning, what we are after. Some very simple associations that will build confidence in what we do. Okay, so then we're going to do the slightly more complicated things, how to read the values and attitudes and kind of more subtle, if you wish, preferences from text. Okay, so what are we going to do? We're going to focus on three things: risk-taking, trust, and gender norms. Why? We could have focused on anything. We focused on those because from an economic point of view, these are economically relevant factors. You can think about other factors that are, like honesty, like reverence to elderly. You can pick your favorite characteristic and code it. I'm going to show you three things, how we did them. We used MTurks, and how we would do it today, we would use basically AI, and I'm going to show you a little bit of that as well. Okay, so now you may be asking the question, how did this data, how was this collected? At the beginning, as I told you, you should think of stories as being distilled into motifs. That's not what we do. That's where Bereskin comes in, our hero, our oral historian, that does already this coding from the original stories to the motifs. What is a motif? I have pressed so many times Yuri. He's a very generous scholar and human. It's hard to get a clear definition. The closest I could get to a definition is like a recurrent image, idea, or symbol that develops or explains a tale. It often, but not always, takes the form of an actor, an item, and an incident. And there is this interesting observation that a tale can map into many motifs. So this is like a rich story. And one motif can appear in many different stories. So we don't have stories, remember, we have motifs, and that's how folklorists think about it. They say, look, the stories are much easier to manipulate. Motifs are easier to, at least in their minds, easier to code. So it's a 0-1. So there's, again, going back to what Jose said there, the famous classification comes from Arne ATU classification of 2,300 stories, available for 144 groups. Again, this is very much used. It's more Eurocentric, so it's not, if you were to try to have a global comparison, that would perhaps be not the appropriate index. It has a European focus. It's commonly used among folklorists interested in European oral traditions. Now, let me also mention here that, of course, this is like a fractal. If you are really interested in the folklore of let's say, the Greeks, then there are actually oral historians that specialize on Greek folklore, and they can actually give you a very granular understanding of what is the guys on the islands, on the Ionian Islands versus the Aegean Islands, in that village in the Epirus versus that village in, in Macedonia. So it's like the more you want to focus on a region, the more you can find the appropriate oral historian that has done a lot of work on that region. So now our focus is global. So the two global databases is the ATU and the Bereskin index. Okay, so just to give you broad idea of what is the categories here, we have 1,000 groups, as I told you. The broad categories, one is about cosmology and etiology. This is about like origins of the Earth, like how the Earth came to be, why we die, what is death, where diseases are coming from. And then there's another half of motifs, roughly speaking, which describe animal stories, adventures, tricks, competitions, the king asking a hero to do something and the hero does it or does not, fails or succeeds. It has some partial overlap with ATU, but not perfect overlap because it started from the Americas. Okay, here's like just to give an idea of what is a motif. Like a motif here is a title, task giver is a king or a chief. What is the description? Person who gives difficult tasks to the hero is a prominent figure in the hierarchy, is the head of the unit, of the political unit, or a higher level and not a mythical being. This is like whatever, 219 groups. The Earth Grows Big, that was actually one of my favorites. Why was my favorite? Because I had a theoretical physicist friend at Dartmouth that he was working on the inflation phase of the universe. So then I read this motif that says, original Earth was small and later increased in size, or the fertile soil grew from a small amount of original substance. And it's a pretty widespread myth, 280 groups. So I call up my friend and say, man, what are you doing? Like, this is already known about a couple of 100 years before you started. I was making fun of him. He eventually joined Goldman Sachs and he's making a lot of money right now. I don't know if it is a causal link to the story that I told him. Okay, but that's the fixed ideas. Some motifs are super spreaders. They are kind of almost universal. You can find them in the Americas, in Southeast Asia, in Africa, in Europe, and others are very local. You can find them in a handful of groups, like 2, 3, and usually adjacent or neighboring ones. So you can start thinking of what makes for a universal narrative and what makes for a local narrative. We actually have a paper developing these days where we are linking these motifs to stories of movies. I mean, the outlines of movies, showing that like movies that harp on motifs that are universal, that is, you can find them in many, many different cultures across the globe, these movies actually become blockbusters. They're more easier to sell. They're generating more money. Whereas those other movies whose motifs, if you wish, are less universal, are only local to few cultures, they face more difficulties in being successful. Okay, so where is the material of Bereskin? This is when I asked him, okay, can you give me where the data is coming from? Then he sent me a beautiful doc that I had arrays reading for about 2 months to understand all these sources. So it's like thousands of references. We were introduced to the beautiful world of folklore. They have their own set of journals, their own set of monographs. Many publications are in English, a bunch are in Russian, many in Spanish. He speaks all these languages, of course. There's also some other languages that he doesn't speak, so he will use the data from translation. So he's like kind of this mythical humanist, Yuri Bereskin, that kind of gets this information, holds it in his brain. He has a developing database that he updates almost every 6 months, and he keeps on reading, keeps on updating. The version of the data we use, according to his understanding, is that it says is relatively complete for Europe and the Americas, is developing about 75% in Africa and about 80% in Asia. So he says, I will never finish it. Of course, it's futile, but as time goes by, I will keep on updating. The updates become smaller and smaller. But yeah, that's how it is. So for the Median Society in Bereskin Corpus, we have 15 publications by 12 authors, 14 publishers in 3.5 languages. The median publication date is 1970. The median date of the first publication is 1904. The way you would like to think about it is that there is a big publication about the myths of the Northern Irish published in 1860. And then there is revisions, entering journals, revising, denying or doubling, editing basically the information that was done in the initial volume. Okay, so that's a distribution. That's kind of when these things came to be written, and Okay, so here's an example of an oral tradition. This is the Lao oral tradition. You can see the variation in the scholars. The earliest one is a female, Fleeson, in 1899, and then there's other publications in French, in German, in Russian, and so on and so forth. So why I picked that? First, because I could read it immediately from the Harvard Library. Someone did not pay its fine, so then they basically posted the book. So don't read the book, or at least, this is the introduction of the publisher that says it's the first time that we actually get to print the stories of these Lao people. And this lady, the author, was basically a missionary staying there, learning the language for a few years. So she actually came back and yeah. So that's the stories in the specific book. Don't read the stories. This is a specific story. I picked it because when I read it, I said, oh my God, I know this story. What is the story? It's a man loses an axe, a spirit or a powerful official suggests him a golden axe. The man does not accept it. The spirit says, you're an honest guy. I'm going to reward you with basically both what you lost and also the golden and the silver axe. I grew up knowing this story. This is Aesop fables, according to my own oral tradition. What I did not know is that you can find this story in about another 53 societies. Boom. So this actually opened up my mind. So this is what we have. We have basically 3,000 stories, dots, and their spread and where they are. This is now also, makes you feel about the diversity, right? You feel that what is defined by Greek is a bunch of stories, but of course there is partial overlap because what the Greek knows as his own Aesop fables are shared, part of that, with other oral traditions. So here is, as I told you, some super spreaders, stories that can be found everywhere, 300-400 groups, and some that are more local, found in about 10-12 groups. There are many caveats. You may ask yourself, when did the stories come to be? This is kind of the holy grail of the oral historians. They are, this was kind of in the beginning, they were trying to find out who told the story first, in what place. So where and when. We don't have a good idea of that. There is a bunch of publications out there that take a specific motif and try to trace it back to a given location. There are some very nice papers that use glottochronology and dyadic analysis to go back to the earliest ancestor that is shared between two groups that have the same story. So they can say, okay, if two groups that speak different language have the same story, it means that they come from a common ancestor. So when did they diverge? Linguistically, they diverged 3,000 years ago. So it's a high chance that this story was actually already known by then because they can trace it to a period where they were not actually, where they were still speaking the same language before diverging. Okay, so here's some, but for us, again, I just want to impress the point that when did these stories come in? We don't know. What we know is that they were alive when they were recorded. By when? Late 19th century, early 20th century. That's kind of a snapshot, and some are potentially much earlier. Okay, how many unique legends? It doesn't matter. What matters is a motif, according to folklorists. So, okay, so here's a widespread motif. Kinsman of hero's wife or bride tried to kill or test him, suggesting difficult tasks. You can find it everywhere. It's kind of like the Darwinian story that you want to make sure that the information of your genes is passed to the best potential candidate. It seems that culturally, this is every society had to come up with a way to screen among potential, matches. And some are very local, whatever. Here's a story about how oysters became black. It's just because, they got burned. Okay, so here is the coverage of groups. I'll take another basically 10 minutes and then I'll stop. Here's the groups across the world. According to Bereskin, we geocoded them. There is a very rich coverage in Americas. This is where he did his PhD, so that's not surprising. That's the coverage in Africa. It's not bad. I have known a little bit more about Africa, but it's also developing. And here is like, if you ask the question, in which places you find a lot of motifs, what you will find is that Northerners, be it in Europe or in Vancouver or in northern latitudes, they seem to be territories that are fertile for more stories. Again, if you ask Bereskin himself, that he has written a lot about this spread of motifs, his main idea is that where historically you had highways of other large migration movements, or a lot of trade. These would be places where basically you would eventually get to be exposed to different cultures, different narratives, and then find much more. That's why he says in Africa, it has never been a highway of civilizations going back and forth, hence the relatively low number of motifs that have at least been registered in the data set. For us, what I'm going to do, I'm going to be normalizing. I'm going to say, okay, you have 100 stories, 100 motifs, 200 motifs, 50 motifs. How many of those are about earthquakes? How many of those are depicting women doing something that seems to be naive or intelligent? So it's going to be always a share vis-a-vis your corpus of motifs. Okay, so how we're going to do that? We're going to basically do it, use kind of, think of it as a word embedding. So we're going to take for every word in the English dictionary, we're going to take the 50 most related words. So for earthquake would be earthquake, tremor, and actually not many more, because it's for earthquake, it's a very specific way to talk about it. And then I'm going to basically go through and say, okay, is this motif tagged as mentioning something related to freedom, scarcity, love, revenge? And then what I can do, I can find out quickly, and we have this data set made available already, what is the share of motifs among the Greeks, among the Catalans, among the Irish that have this intensity of give and trade. Now, for the ones that are going to require a bit more nuanced understanding, like does this motif encourage risk-taking or does this motif discourage risk-taking, this word counting exercise will not be appropriate. So we will do what? We will have MTurks to read and tell us whether they think the motif depicts the women in a given way, depicts action taking in a positive way, the hero survives or the hero dies, so that we can actually measure more appropriately. This is what we can do differently these days. We can actually do it using AI. We can actually use CBT or your favorite LLM to read a given motif and ask what particular question you want. Okay, so the first part is the physical environment reflected in the oral tradition. What I'm going to show you, I'm going to show you some correlations as promised. These dots is kind of the bin scatter plot. This is kind of the groups. Of course, there are many more groups, but here is like an impressionistic. This is like across the 1,000 groups that we have geolocated. Those that are further away from high impact zones, they are systematically less likely to basically talk about share of motifs that mention earthquakes goes down. How about storms? Do we talk about thunderstorms a lot? What I'm going to take out whether there is the intensity of lightning and thunder the last 20 years. This is what I can measure. And I can see that, if you live in a region that it's actually rains and storms a lot, you're going to have a lot of stories about about thunder and how the thunder was created, who did that. And so it's usually any etiological story, or the earthquakes. Why on earth is the earth trembling? Is because the dead are dancing or trying to come out. That would be a common motif that you would find in earthquake zones. How about like in places that have whatever, the 25 Celsius and above on average? This would be as the southern Mediterraneans. We never talk about frozen things, or like very rarely. It's not something that comes out. Okay, now let me go and meet Ethnographic Atlas, and there I'm going to ask the question, okay, we have the Ethnographic Atlas, I know this, I have the not the folklorists, the ethnographers that have put some data on, is this a pastoral society, is this an agricultural society, is this a kingly society, is this a society that, I don't know, does a lot of hunting versus fishing. So then I can match this to the groups in Bereskin, and then I can have their stories. So then I can go back and say, okay, if it is a fishing society, from the folklorists, I actually can tell their intensity of how often you talk about fish. And then you can actually say, look, you are a fishing society, you observe, you get a lot more from fishing in folklore. If you're a hunting society, you talk about hunt. These are the correlations. If you're a pastoral society, I think this is agriculture, you talk more about basically what? Wheat, rice, and corn. These are the most common crops. If you're a pastoralist, you talk about cows, herd, and cattle. And if you're a fishing society, according to ethnographers, you are going to have more stories that involve some type of fishing activity. So this is kind of, adding credibility to this database. Like I now have my ancestral societies, some coding of their characteristics, and now, thanks to Bereskin, I have their stories. How about, if you come from a centralized society, politically centralized, we did something very simple, say, how often is the king a theme in your tradition? And you get this very clear thing that if you're a stateless society, the king is never there to tell you what to do. If you are coming from a very centralized one, the king is the dominant theme. Either positive or negative, we don't take this view, is that he's there. He is a dominant theme in that tradition. Okay. Now, what I think was important for economists was to say, okay, what is it there for economists? Trade, something that we could not code from other sources. We could actually get it from this database. How many motifs do you get from trade in a given oral tradition? Then we can actually visualize it. So this is actually darker dots are the ones that have more trade stories. And now how can you corroborate whether this makes sense or not? You can actually, correlated with trade routes. Are you closer to pre-industrial trade routes? You can actually see that the further away you are from pre-industrial trade routes, this on your left-hand side, you are much less likely to start talking about trade in your motifs. So that's kind of impressionistic again, increasing the credibility, hopefully, of this endeavor. Okay, now let's move to the country level. Now, why I want to go to the country level? I want to go to the country level because I want to basically, when I measure attitudes in my world value surveys or in the Eurobarometers or in any other data set, these are usually country level data sets. So I know how Romanians behave, how the Israelis behave, how the Greeks, how the Spaniards. So then I'm going to take my data, which is at the group level. For example, in Spain, I have the Catalans. So the Catalans are about 15% of the Spanish. The Spanish are about 40%. The Galicians are 10%. I'm going to aggregate it into, with appropriate weights and say, what is a typical Spanish guy is a composite of the underlying stories that come from a little bit from the Asturias, a little bit from the Catalans, a little bit from the Basques. So that's, now I have my typical Spaniard, my typical Greek, my typical Italian. Okay, now what I would like to do here, I'm going to basically do one thing. I'm going to actually only focus on gender because I think that gender was interesting. And we did it for tricksters and thinking about trust, how trust is built and how risk-taking is built. But I'm going to focus on gender. Why gender? Gender is very important in terms of it has these linkages to many other social sciences. We had to face this issue. How can we measure gender bias in the folklore data? What we did actually was the following. We said, okay, in the media studies, they tell me that there are stereotypes. There are female stereotypes and male stereotypes. So, okay, let me actually borrow from media studies that they think about when they talk about stereotypes, they say, okay, men are usually depicted as violent, dominant, strong, physically active, angry, arrogant, and sexual, and women are more afraid, beautiful, domestic, dependent, and submissive. Okay, so let me take this and ask my M-Turks, read this specific motif, tell me whether you think that this is a depiction of a violent female. Is there a male character or a female character? And check the box that can be more than one that represents what you read. Okay, so then we had 10 M-Turks read that. So we take the model answer because M-Turks may disagree. You may think that it is X. I may think it is X prime. But across 10 people, I can take the most common answer as representing the, what humans think about this specific motif. So then what we can actually find is that, and I can aggregate at the country level, we can see how often males vis-a-vis females, how they are depicted. So for example, this is male representation minus female representation. This minus 0.05 means that on average, males are shown 5% less likely to be submissive compared to females. So there is an overrepresentation of submissive females in the motifs. Who are the dominant ones is this positive number here tells me that males on average are those that are the ones that are more depicted in the stories in the motifs as female, as you know, the males are depicted as dominant. So let me show you the geography of male bias. Darker colors are places where basically women follow all the negative stereotypes and males follow all the positive stereotypes. So there's the man is the dominant, the one guy that runs around, kills the monster. The female is at home waiting for the hero to congratulate and is basically just cooking. So this would be the darker places. And the whiter places, I mean, the more yellowish ones is where the reverse is true. Actually, that females are more, if anything, represented in a defying stereotypes, and males also defying stereotypes. So what does this matter? Well, if we compare, I'm going to basically end with that. One way that we economists usually try to think about gender roles in the labor market, they think about female labor force participation. So here what I show you across countries, I have depicted on the horizontal axis male bias in the country's folklore. So on as you go further to the right, you see countries where basically women are much more traditional roles in the stories narrated and men much more dominant and violent and aggressive roles. And on the left side, you will see countries like Malawi, Lesotho, where basically the opposite is true. In places where gender roles are very fossilized in the stories, this is where you're going to find a lot less labor force participation among females compared to other places. We can do it with second generation immigrants, ask guys in Ireland that come from Pakistan versus those in Ireland that come from Sweden, whether they think that males should or females should work or not, we can still see this relationship going on. And where does this gender bias come from? And I'm going to stop with that. There is some stories out there that, plow societies, because plow is like this Bosrapian hypothesis, has this upper body strength. So once plow was introduced, then you would see a division of labor, leaving women at home, taking care of the rest of the chores, and males, because they have a comparative advantage in upper body strength, specializing in the agriculture. What we see on the left side is that actually societies now, I'm back into the society level, not country level, that have more plow. The stories are much more unequal in terms of having a much more large gender bias. I'm going to basically stop and just basically give you time to digest what we saw with this. I want to just leave this as applications that have come out of this project, not by myself, but by other scholars in the field, how this folklore catalog has been used. And, I will not walk you through the applications, but I will be happy to share the slides after the talk so that you can see how basically people have started using this data set to inform explorations about either understanding how history shaped historical outcomes or how history shapes contemporary outcomes.